All right, welcome back. Continuing from where we left off last time. Last time we updated our server here to accept this port system property as a parameter when we start up. So that way we can dynamically configure what port this server is running on. And our other properties are going to be part of a configuration file. So we'll load all this other stuff that we've hard-coded in here from a configuration file. Now, something I didn't really explain, why we're treating port differently than we're going to treat these other properties. So the reason is when we run multiple servers on a single node, right? Like when we deploy this on an AWS node, we're going to want to run two separate servers, and the only difference between those two servers is the port that they're going to run on. So we'll have one, the first instance of our tutorial API server running on, port 8001, for example, and then the second instance will run on port 8002, and then all these other properties, they will retrieve from the same configuration file, right? They can share the same P12 certificate information. This is going to be the same. The password's going to be the same. The directory where HTML resources are served from will be the same. Like everything's going to be the same except for the port. So that's why we're treating the port slightly differently. So when it comes to configuration information, we've got a few different options, and there are a few different libraries that we can use to manage this configuration, or we can not use any external libraries and just use Java, a property, Java util.properties object to manage this information as well. So we have a lot of options here. We could store this configuration information in GitHub itself and have our server dynamically fetch that information from the web page, the GitHub web page. So that's kind of useful in that we can, in order to update the configuration, we can just go to our GitHub project, right? And if we had a system properties in here, we could edit it from GitHub. It's all configuration managed. So if we break something, we could look and see what changes we made to it and roll those changes back. So that's one option. Another option is to just read the configuration file off disk in some directory somewhere. We would have some version locally, in our source code that we can run our test server here as we're doing development. And then once we deploy it on AWS, we can put it in etc system config or wherever we want to put it, and just read it off the disk on our node. So that's another option. It doesning matter too much how we do it. Usually when I'm managing servers, in AWS, I'm SSHing into the server and looking at logs and things like that. So I'm on the server already. So it's easy to, it's easy to just SSH in and change configuration files if we need that. Another option that we want is the ability to dynamically reload our configuration properties. So if we have our two servers up and running, and we want to change a configuration, a database timeout or something like that, what we don't want is to have to bounce our servers in order to pick up that change. They should pick up that change automatically, best case. So that's another feature that we will probably want at some point in the future. So with those thoughts in mind, I think what I'm going to do initially is implement configuration where we pull from GitHub and demonstrate that and what that code would look like, and then basically delete that code and just use local files. I don't feel strongly about which approach. We could just leave it in GitHub as well, so it doesn't really matter that much. So I'll start with GitHub, and then we'll, I guess, decide a little bit after, later on. So what we'll do is we'll create some initial files. I guess we'll create them at the top level, our configuration files. So what we want is a We'll call it system.properties, but we want a dev configuration, which is going to have these properties, that we've already hard coded here, and we'll use that dev configuration when we're just running locally. And then we'll have a prod configuration that we use actually on our servers once we're in a deploy environment. So let's go ahead and create a system dev.properties and a system prod.properties. Now I named them this way. Like if I had dev at the beginning, then this file would be up here above Palm and README, and then prod would be after Palm. So I just put system at the beginning just to keep these two files close together. So I'll go ahead and we'll ignore system prod for now. Let's go ahead and put just some of this information in here up into our properties file, and we'll format this. Let's delete this stuff. We actually will only need one of these passwords. And we'll call this, let's see, like server.keystore.file type and password. And they're gray right now because we're not actually using them, and that's fine. We will end up with these in our production file as well. I'll go ahead and add them. So this one will probably be something like etc sysconfig tutorial API, tutorial API.p12, something like that. Change it, I'll leave this password, change it for now. Doesn't really matter. It might be changing on the server too. We wouldn't have to use sysconfig necessarily. We'll talk about this more in detail. Like I could use something like opt tutorial API conf, right? So we could keep everything in this tutorial API directory and have everything co-located, or we can kind of spread it out in the various places where, like in this example, put config stuff in etc sysconfig, put logs in var log, right? So we can talk about those details later on. I think what my current plan is to put files in typical Linux places and then have symlinks in opt tutorial API where you could find this file in both places. But this one would be a symlink, or actually probably this conf directory would be a symlink to etc sysconfig tutorial API. So that way you could access this file in both places. For now, I'll leave it like this though. Okay, so we've got our files. Let's go ahead and do a quick Maven clean install just to verify that everything's still built. I think I'm going to stop doing cleans now. Like we've got our project set up enough where we don't need to clean every time. Let's do git status, see what we've changed. We did change our port stuff, so I'll go ahead and commit all this at the same time. Okay, so now we're pushed up. If I bring this over here and refresh, I'll see our two configuration files here. So if I click on system dev, right, I get this path where I can see it. If I click raw, then I have access to this raw file. And so what I'm going to do is copy this URL, and then we'll use that URL to download this file. So let's save that URL first. Into a variable. Now, so this dev part will need to change depending on what mode our server is running in, right? When we just click play here in our IDE, we want it to use dev. So dev will be the default, and we'll, like when we're running from our server in AWS or wherever, then we'll want it to run with prod in here instead of dev. So basically what we need is a dev mode environment or property that we pass in that tells us which file that we should use. So I'll do the string mode, I guess, or profile. There's a few different words we could use for this. I'll just leave it mode for now. I guess that makes sense. We don't need to convert it into an integer, and we want dev to be the default. And then this URL, we can do a string format on it and put mode in there. So that way, if we don't pass in this system property, just like we did the port in the last video, then it will default to dev, and this %s will be converted into dev, and our URL will look like dev mode. I'm kind of hanging off the end here of my 120 line, so I'm just going to static import this format, not by right clicking on it, and that way that brings my line in just a little bit. It doesn't matter that much, but just pretty code's pretty. So, okay, so we have our URL defined. Now let's talk about what library we're going to use to actually download this. We could do all this downloading stuff manually ourselves, but there's no need to do it manually when libraries can do it for us. There are a few different Java configuration libraries, right? So we could even search, Java configuration library. This one's 2011, so no need to look that old. Yeah, so config4j, that's a relatively newish library. Lightbend config, also called typesafe config, is a common one. I've clicked this link before, so I've definitely looked at it in the recent past. So it's last updated September 16th, so it's still maintained. It's a little bit confusing. It's under Lightbend, but the library itself is called typesafe. Yeah, com.typesafe. I think typesafe, the company, renamed itself or rebranded itself Lightbend. So there's a little bit of confusion there maybe. But let's go ahead and use typesafe config. So I'll copy this Maven dependency up here. So we'll put the dependency with a version. So it's com.typesafe, which would come after ch. Let me copy this. So we've got the dependency defined in our dependency management in our top level POM. Now let's add it into our server POM in here. And since we have the version defined in our dependency management, we don't need that version here. All right, let's comment why we're using this. So used for loading system configuration. All right, so now we've got our POMs updated. Let me Maven reload this so it picks up those new libraries. All right, so typesafe config has a config factory, which I don't see in my list here. So potentially Maven didn't update yet. Let me actually comment this out and run a Maven over here. Yeah, because IntelliJ sometimes doesn't actually download dependencies even after I specify them. I do see some warnings. So it should have. I didn't see any downloads either. Yeah, so there are some warnings. We'll worry about that in the future. So let me just do a Maven reload one more time. Okay, I see it turned yellow, which means it added an import for it. So not sure exactly why I didn't get it the first time. This class has a bunch of static methods that return config objects, and I see parse URL up here at the very top. But there are others too, like load. So if we were going to just load it from a file on disk or a file on the class path, we could use parse file. Probably there's a parse resource in here. Parse resource on the class path. Parse properties, a Java properties object. There's parse string in here, I believe. Yeah, so we could, have a, if we're gonna use this in unit tests or integration tests, we could parse strings to fake loading configuration without actually having to read it from a URL or from disk or something. So there's a lot of options there. We'll use parse URL. There are two of them. One just takes a URL object. One takes a config parse options. We don't need these options at all. We'll just use the default options. So we'll use this one. We need a URL like that. Now this new URL throws a malformed URL exception if our URL is invalid. We already have a throws exception excuse me, up here from our Jetty server, which just throws an exception. Yeah. If I hover over, you can see exception here in the throws. So yeah, if our URL is invalid for some reason, which is unlikely because we basically typed it in here, hard coded. Maybe there's an invalid character that we end up getting passed in, which makes it invalid, something like that. But if that happens, then we'll end up with an exception on startup, and we'd have to go fix it. So not an issue there. That makes sense that we would have to do that. All right, so this returns a config object, and then within this config, we can fetch out this other information. So for example, I'll put it down here in a minute, but we can do config.getString, right? And then we would pass in the key. So up here in our dev properties, the key is this part here. My mouse isn't actually working. Potentially the battery's about to die. So this is the key here, server.keystore.file. So we could do something like this. And we could do that for all these other three as well. So let's actually do this and then just log what we get. Just to verify that we can actually fetch this file down and everything. So we'll go ahead and hit run here. Rebuilds for us. Okay, we get the server running, we get our key store output, and then once it gets far enough, it goes ahead and starts down at the bottom. Okay, so this looks good. It's successfully downloading this HTTPS file from GitHub. That means if we came over here in our GitHub and navigated to this properties, we could edit it from this web page, right? So if there was a problem, we need to fix the password or whatever, we can edit this file directly from here, make the change, commit the change. Once we made it look however we wanted, and then our server, currently we don't have any kind of reload capability, but if we bounce the server, then it would fetch that new configuration, from GitHub. So it's currently working great for that first fetch. We don't have any reload, so we can worry about the auto reload later on. I don't like seeing these Jetty messages. We see these every time we start. We don't really care at this point what Jetty is logging. So I'm going to come in here to our logback and do org.eclipse.jetty and set it to warn. So that way we don't need to see these info logs, but if Jetty has a warning of some kind, then we'll see those. Okay, so I'll go ahead and take a break here. We've got our initial config set up. Next time we'll actually use that config information here. We'll also add additional configure information for this. And what I don't want is to hard code these configuration property keys everywhere. So we'll create an enumeration to manage what these properties look like. All right, that's it for this one. Share, subscribe, like, comment, all that good YouTube stuff. And I appreciate it. See you next time.